Hello, my name is Sarah Chen. I am writing this because I have recently emerged from a series of events that most people would find hard to believe. What I am about to share is the full account of those years, how I entered a life that looked like a dream, how I discovered the nightmare hidden beneath the surface, and how I finally dismantled the walls that were built to keep me silent. This is what happened. For 3 years, I lived inside a carefully constructed cage. It had marble floors and crystal chandeliers and a prestigious Manhattan address. And the bars were made not of iron but of manipulation, financial coercion, and the slow, deliberate poisoning of everything I believed myself to be. I endured it. I documented it. And then, when the moment was precisely right, not a day early, not a single piece of evidence short, I dismantled it completely. What follows is the full account of what happened. I have not softened it. I have not made it comfortable. Some of it is ugly, and some of it is the kind of thing that, even now, requires me to stop and breathe before I continue. But I promised myself, when I boarded a plane on the other side of all of this, that I would tell the truth. So, let me tell you everything. I was born in Boston on a Wednesday in February, during a snowstorm that shut down 3 major highways and delayed my father by 45 minutes at a hospital parking garage, because he could not, even in the most dramatic circumstances of his life, find a space close to the entrance. This is, I think, the most perfectly James Chen detail. I can offer you a brilliant, meticulous, fundamentally decent man, running through a blizzard to reach his daughter, still trying to do things correctly. My father, James Chen, built Chentech Solutions from nothing. He was a software engineer who believed, with the quiet certainty of someone who has actually done the math, that if you wrote good code and treated people honestly and worked harder than everyone else in the room, the world would eventually recognize what you had made. He coded in the mornings before sunrise. He sketched interface designs on napkins at dinner. He talked about his company the way other fathers talked about their children, with a tenderness that was embarrassing and beautiful in equal measure. Chantech was his masterpiece. By the time I was in high school, it employed 43 people and was on the verge of a licensing deal that would have made it one of the most valuable mid-sized software companies in New England. My father was 51 years old, and he was 3 months away from the culmination of his life's work. He never got there. But I am getting ahead of myself. I will tell you about Chentech later. I will tell you about my father. I will tell you about what I discovered, and what it cost me to discover it, and what I did with what I found. For now, I inherited my father's mind and my mother's spine. My mother, Lin Chen, was a woman who could walk into any room and immediately identify its structural load-bearing points, social, financial, emotional, and position herself accordingly. She was not calculating in a cold way. She was strategic in a survivor's way, the way you become when you have had to fight for every advantage you possess. And you have learned, through experience rather than theory, that the world does not automatically reward the deserving. From my father, I got precision and patience. From my mother, I got the ability to read a room before anyone in it knew they were being read. I studied finance at Columbia University. I graduated summa cum laude in 3.5 years because I did not sleep as much as my peers, and I was constitutionally incapable of submitting work I considered substandard. I joined Meridian Capital Partners at 24, the youngest risk analyst in the firm's 90-year history. By 27, I was leading a team. By 29, I managed a portfolio worth $340 million. And had the kind of professional reputation that causes certain people in certain rooms to lower their voices slightly when you walk in. I owned a penthouse apartment in Tribeca. I drove a modest car. I wore expensive clothes that announced nothing. I had learned, in the world of high finance, that the people who broadcast their wealth are almost always the ones who are about to lose it. Real security is quiet. It does not need to be performed. I was 31 years old, and I was, by every metric I knew how to apply, exactly where I had planned to be. And then I met David Whitmore at a charity gala on the Upper East Side. And for 18 months I stopped applying metrics, and that was my first and most costly mistake. The gala was for a children's literacy foundation. The room was full of people who had written large checks and wanted to be seen having done so, which is a legitimate form of philanthropy even if it is not a particularly pure one. I was there because one of my clients had insisted, and because I had learned that charity galas are excellent places to conduct certain kinds of reconnaissance. You can learn more about a person's actual financial situation from watching them navigate an open bar and a silent auction than from reading 6 months of their quarterly reports. David Whitmore found me near the silent auction tables, examining a lot that included a weekend at some estate in the Hudson Valley. He was taller than I expected. I had registered him from across the room as a general impression of good tailoring and easy confidence, and up close. He resolved into someone more specific, warm brown eyes, a laugh that arrived genuinely rather than performatively, the kind of face that had been good-looking for so long that it had settled into something easier than beauty. "You're actually reading the lot descriptions," he said. "Not quite an observation, not quite a compliment. I'm deciding whether the estate is actually worth what they're asking," I said, "or whether the description is doing more work than the property justifies." He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised, delighted. "And? The description is definitely doing more work," I said. His name was David Whitmore. His family had money, old money, the kind that comes from several generations of people making reasonable decisions and not making catastrophic ones, which is less rare than truly building something, but considerably more stable. He worked at his family's investment firm, which he described with a self-deprecating humor that I found endearing. He asked about my work with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, which was not universal in rooms like that one. I am telling you this carefully because I want you to understand David Whitmore was not, in those early months, a performance. The warmth was real. The humor was real. The attentiveness was real. What was not real, what I did not understand until much later, was his independence. David was charming and kind in the way that a plant in an expensive pot is beautiful, genuinely, observably, but entirely dependent on its container for survival. Remove him from Eleanor's orbit, and he had no gravitational field of his own. I did not see this. I was in love. And love, as I have concluded, after considerable evidence, the single most dangerous form of cognitive bias in the human repertoire. It does not merely distort judgment. It actively suppresses the faculties most necessary for accurate assessment. It makes you want to be wrong about the things that concern you. We married 18 months after that gala. The ceremony was held at the Whitmore family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a Georgian mansion on 12 acres, the kind of property that announces several generations of comfort without a single tasteless detail. The gardens were immaculate. The champagne was excellent. The string quartet played something I had requested, a particular Schubert piece my father had loved. My father had been dead for 6 years by then. He died of a heart attack at 61, 2 years after his company collapsed. I thought about him all through that ceremony. I thought about how much he would have wanted to be there, and how much he would have worried. My father always worried, quietly, precisely, about the things that mattered. And I told myself his worry would have been unfounded. I was wrong, but I did not know that yet. What I did know, standing at the altar of that Greenwich estate, was that something was off about Eleanor Whitmore's embrace. She held me for exactly the right amount of time. She said exactly the right things. She kissed me on each cheek with exactly the right warmth. And behind every exactly right thing, like a frequency just below hearing, was something I could not name but could not quite ignore. I filed it away. I was good at filing things away. For approximately 11 months, I was wrong to have filed it. And then I was catastrophically right. Eleanor Whitmore conducted her reconnaissance with a patience and precision that I can only describe as, in retrospect, genuinely impressive. She was 63 years old and she had been playing this particular game for decades. I was a new variable. She spent the first year of my marriage to her son quietly, methodically mapping me. The lunches came first. Twice a month, Eleanor would invite me to one of the private dining rooms at her preferred Midtown club. The kind of place where the menu is not on the table because members are not expected to require it, and where the staff addresses everyone by name and title. She was charming at these lunches. She was curious. She asked about my work, my childhood, my father's company, my investment philosophy. My plans for children, my relationship with my own mother, my sense of the family's future. I answered honestly and with the instinctive reserve of someone who has never found it comfortable to disclose too much too quickly. I thought Eleanor was getting to know her daughter-in-law. I did not understand until much later that she was conducting a comprehensive intake assessment. The gallery openings came next. Eleanor moved through New York's cultural establishment the way experienced generals move through territory. They have spent years studying with apparent ease that is actually the product of meticulous preparation. She introduced me to everyone. She was warm and proprietorial in a way that should have been its own signal. She introduced me as our Sarah, before she had known me 6 months, and the possessive was not affectionate. It was territorial. Then came the suggestions. The first one arrived at dinner, a family dinner at the Greenwich Estate, 4 months after our wedding. Eleanor was describing some project the family was considering, something to do with expanding the investment firm's real estate holdings, and she said very casually, as though it had just occurred to her, "Of course, it would all be much simpler if we operated from a unified capital structure. Richard and I have always found that family finances function best when they're consolidated. It eliminates so much administrative friction." David nodded. He always nodded. It was his primary mode of engagement with his mother, a continuous, low-level nodding that signified either agreement or the performance of agreement, or simply the absence of any intention to disagree. I had not yet learned to parse the differences. I said something neutral and moved the conversation toward the wine. Eleanor accepted the redirect with a smile that did not change her eyes. Over the following months, the suggestions became more specific. A comment about the inefficiency of maintaining separate bank accounts between spouses. A mention of how David's position at the firm might benefit from access to certain liquidity. A question, framed as idle curiosity, about the structure of my investment holdings and whether I had ever considered a family trust arrangement. Each time I deflected. Each time, Eleanor accepted the deflection with the equanimity of someone who is not in any hurry, because they are playing a longer game than the one currently on the board. By the end of the first year, I had filed away 14 separate incidents, not consciously, not yet deliberately, that came later. But I had a mind that categorizes as automatically as it breathes, and what I was categorizing was a pattern, a slow, patient, systematic campaign to establish Eleanor's authority over my financial life. The question I had not yet answered was why. The Whitmore family had money. Old, stable, established money. Why would Eleanor Whitmore need my assets? The answer, when it came, was so much worse than anything I had imagined. Ethan Park and I had worked together at Meridian Capital for 6 years before I left to marry David. He is a forensic financial analyst, the kind of specialist you call when the numbers don't add up. And you need someone to find the specific moment and mechanism of their divergence. He had a mind like a very clean, very precise instrument. It did not miss things, and it did not misrepresent what it found. He was also the most trustworthy person I knew, which is a quality I do not assign carelessly. I called him 14 months into my marriage on a Tuesday evening in September from a bench in Central Park, where I was reasonably certain no one I knew would see me on a phone call. I was not yet sure I was going to admit to having made. "I need you to look at something for me," I said when he picked up. Quietly. "How quietly?" he asked. He had known me long enough to understand the distinction. "Ghost level," I said. A pause. The sound of him setting something down. "Tell me what you have." What I had was a set of discrepancies. Small ones. Individually the kind of thing that looks like noise if you're not trained to read signal. But in the Whitmore family's publicly available financial records, in the investment firm's quarterly disclosures, in certain property records, that were technically public but practically obscure, there were gaps, numbers that did not quite reconcile, assets that should have appeared in certain places and did not, a pattern of transfers that was consistent with, and I want to be precise here, because at that point I had no proof, only instinct, a pattern consistent with a family that was managing the appearance of wealth rather than wealth itself. Ethan listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been bothering you?" he asked. "Since the wedding," I said. "And you're calling me now because Because she asked me last week to sign a power of attorney, I said. Gerald Park's firm, giving the Whitmore family financial management authority over my assets in the event of circumstances that might impair my judgment. Another pause. Longer this time. Send me what you have. This stays between us, I said. I need you to understand that completely. Whatever you find until I decide what to do with it, this stays between us. Sarah, Ethan said, with the patient certainty of someone who has never needed to make that point twice. When have I ever been anything other than exactly what you needed me to be? I could not argue with that. I sent him the files. It took Ethan 6 weeks to build the initial picture. He worked through his own network former colleagues at regulatory agencies, contacts at 3 different accounting firms, a particular attorney who specialized in untangling shell company structures, and what he assembled over those 6 weeks was a portrait of the Whitmore family's finances that bore very little resemblance to their public presentation. The Whitmore family was, at its core, nearly insolvent. Not bankrupt, they were too sophisticated for straightforward bankruptcy, and Eleanor was too careful. But the underlying structure was a cycle of debt, the kind that functions indefinitely as long as new capital enters the system, but collapses the moment it stops. The Greenwich estate was mortgaged to 80% of its value. The Manhattan properties were leveraged against lines of credit that required constant servicing. The investment firm managed other people's money with reasonable competence, but generated insufficient fee income to support the family's lifestyle independently. For years, Ethan's preliminary estimate was at least a decade. The gap had been covered through a network of shell companies that moved money in complex enough patterns to obscure its origin. Those companies, when traced through several layers of registration in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, led back to Eleanor's personal accounts. The money in Eleanor's accounts came from private lenders. The private lenders charged rates that were not reported to any regulatory body and used methods of enforcement that were correspondingly unofficial. The Whitmore family's wealth was, in the most precise and technical sense, borrowed. And the people they had borrowed it from were not patient investors. I read Ethan's report in my home office at 2 in the morning, with the city quiet outside and a cup of tea gone cold beside my laptop. I read it twice. Then I sat very still for approximately 4 minutes, which is the amount of time my nervous system required to process information of that magnitude before my analytical functions could resume. Eleanor had not been trying to supplement her family's wealth with mine. She had been trying to replace it. The family asset consolidation she had been quietly engineering for 14 months was not a power play by a wealthy woman who wanted more control. It was a lifeline for a family that was drowning. My $340 million in managed assets, my Tribeca penthouse, my investment portfolio in 7 countries in Eleanor's calculation, these were not my property. They were the solution to a problem she had been managing for a decade. I called Ethan at 2:30 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. I need to know everything, I said. Not just the structure, everything. Go back as far as you need to go. How far is far enough? He asked. As far as it goes, I said. Sarah. His voice was careful. This is going to take time, and it's going to find things that are hard to find. I know, I said. I'm not asking you to make it easy. I'm asking you to make it complete. A long pause. All right, he said. I'll need more resources. Attorneys. Possibly a forensic accountant with SEC clearance. Whatever you need, I said. Bill me at full rate. Document everything. One more thing, Ethan said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter and more careful. What you're describing, building a full evidentiary picture against the family of a man you are currently married to, this is not a small decision. Once we start, the process has a logic of its own. Are you certain about the direction? I looked out my office window at the city. Somewhere below, in the bedroom down the hall, David was asleep. Probably. He had been asleep, or performing sleep, with increasing frequency over the past year. It was his primary method of avoiding conversations I had learned to stop trying to have. I'm certain about the evidence, I said. The decisions come after. All right, Ethan said again. And the investigation, in earnest, began. While Ethan built the picture from the outside, I continued living inside it. This is the part of the story that people find hardest to understand. Why stay? Why continue attending the family dinners, accompanying David to the firm's client events, smiling at Eleanor over summer lunches in Greenwich, while simultaneously building the evidentiary case that would eventually dismantle everything? Because leaving without evidence is just leaving. And leaving was not the point. The point was accuracy. The point was making sure that what I believed to be happening was, in fact, happening, and that I could prove it to any standard of scrutiny that would ever be applied. I am a risk management specialist. My entire professional existence is predicated on not acting on incomplete information, on waiting until the data is sufficient. To support the conclusion, on refusing the seductive comfort of early certainty. I waited. And while I waited, Eleanor escalated. In the second year of my marriage, the requests became demands. Not aggressive demands, Eleanor was never crude. But the language changed. It would be helpful if became, it would make sense for, became the family expects. The lunches at the private club became smaller, less social, more businesslike. Eleanor began bringing documents to these lunches. Papers she wanted me to review. Proposals she presented with the confidence of someone who has decided the negotiation is already concluded and is now managing the paperwork. I declined each proposal. Each time, Eleanor received my refusal with a smile that narrowed by a fraction. Each time I logged the incident date, location, exact language used, documents presented if any, my response, her response. The file grew. David, through all of this, was a weather vane. When Eleanor was pressing, he was evasive. When Eleanor was pleased, he was warm. When Eleanor was strategic, he was oblivious with a precision that I eventually concluded was itself a strategy that David's helplessness was not involuntary but trained. A performance of incapacity that shielded him from having to make choices he did not have the spine to make. I stopped trying to reach him in the second year. Not because I stopped caring. I am honest enough to tell you that I did not stop caring for a long time, and that this was expensive. But because I recognized that trying to reach David was like trying to call someone on a phone that was connected to another person's switchboard. Every call got rerouted. Every message arrived altered. I directed my energy toward what I could control: the documentation, the evidence, the architecture of a case that would one day be complete. I want to tell you about this carefully because it is the moment when the nature of what I was dealing with changed from something I understood into something I had to completely reframe. It was a Thursday evening in November, 22 months into my marriage. Ethan called me at 7 p.m., which was not unusual, and asked if I was somewhere private, which was. "I found something," he said. "I need you to sit down before I tell you what it is." I was already sitting at my desk. I moved my coffee to the side and opened a blank document on my laptop. I take notes compulsively during difficult conversations, because the act of transcribing keeps my analytical functions engaged and prevents the emotional responses from overwhelming the intake. "Tell me," I said. What Ethan had found required him to go back 15 years. He had been following a thread in the Whitmore family's financial records, a particular shell company that appeared repeatedly in transactions from the early 2000s, always in connection with intellectual property acquisitions, always through the same Delaware registration that traced back to a subsidiary of Richard Whitmore's investment firm. The subsidiary had made several IP acquisitions over a period of 3 years. Most of them were unremarkable standard distressed asset purchases. The kind of opportunistic deal that happens routinely in the market when a company fails and its patents become available at bankruptcy pricing. One of them was not unremarkable. Chentech Solutions, my father's company. The core patents from Chentech, the ones my father had spent a decade developing. The foundation of the licensing deal that was going to change. Everything for him had been acquired at bankruptcy pricing by Richard Whitmore's subsidiary 6 months after my father's company collapsed. Those patents were still generating licensing revenue. They had been generating licensing revenue for 15 years through a chain of subsidiary transfers that had kept them invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them, feeding quietly into the Whitmore family's cash flow, while the family that originally held them dissolved into grief and financial ruin. I did not speak for a long time after Ethan finished. Sarah. His voice was very quiet. There's more. Tell me. The bankruptcy wasn't organic. Chentech was 3 months from closing the licensing deal when it failed. That kind of failure at that stage, it doesn't just happen. I found the mechanism. It was a coordinated campaign. False information about code security vulnerabilities, distributed through industry contacts. A key investor withdrawal that traces back to a firm that Richard Whitmore had a silent position in. A regulatory inquiry technically legitimate, but timed and framed to create maximum disruption at maximum vulnerability. That was triggered by an anonymous complaint filed from a registered address that no longer exists but whose registration records I recovered. My hands were completely still on the keyboard. I had stopped typing. Richard Whitmore destroyed my father's company deliberately, I said. It was not a question. The evidence supports that conclusion, Ethan said. I would not have called you tonight if I was not confident in that conclusion. My father had died at 61. Heart attack, the death certificate said. Stress, the doctor said. He had worked his entire life to build something. He had been 3 months from the culmination of that work, and a man who would one day be my father-in-law had chosen to destroy it, not out of malice. I do not think Richard Whitmore was especially malicious, but out of simple greed. The patents were valuable. It was easier to take them than to compete with them. My father died not knowing why. He died thinking he had failed. He died believing that the world had simply not rewarded his honesty and his work, when in fact, the world had been deliberately arranged against him by a man in a better suit. I sat with this information for 6 full minutes. I did not cry. I had done my crying for my father years earlier, and what I felt now was not grief in the conventional sense. It was something colder and more absolute, the complete crystallization of purpose. Document everything, I said. Every piece of it. I want the evidentiary chain to be flawless. No gaps. No ambiguities. Nothing that can be challenged on procedural grounds. I know, Ethan said. I will. And Ethan. I paused. Thank you for finding it. For telling me. Sarah, he said. What are you going to do? The right thing, I said. Thoroughly. I did not think it could get worse than what Ethan had told me about my father. I was wrong. It got worse. For 2.5 years, I had been trying to get pregnant. David and I had discussed children before we married. We both wanted them. The absence of a pregnancy had been a source of quiet, private grief. The kind of grief you carry alone, because it is too tender and too unresolved to be spoken about comfortably, and because the people around you have enough opinions about your reproductive timeline without being invited to contribute more. My medical results were normal. My doctors were cautiously optimistic, advising patience and reduce stress, which advice I received with the expression I use when someone tells me to reduce stress, as though it is a simple logistical matter rather than an existential one. In the 28th month of my marriage, our attorneys obtained, through a civil subpoena connected to the financial investigation, a set of records from Dr. Marcus Harlow, a concierge physician who served the Whitmore family and several other wealthy New York families, operating out of a private practice on Park Avenue. With no insurance billing and no electronic health record system, everything on paper and discretion absolute. Among those records, Ethan's attorney found a prescription. It had been filled quarterly for 3 years. It was a compound medication, a specific formulation not available through standard pharmacies, prepared by a compounding pharmacy in Connecticut that served, almost exclusively, Dr. Harlow's practice. The compound interfered with female fertility by mimicking natural hormonal fluctuation while systematically preventing implantation. In small doses, administered regularly, it was undetectable without specifically targeted testing. Its effects were invisible to standard OB/GYN screening. The prescription was tied to Eleanor Whitmore's personal medical account. The delivery records showed it had been included quarterly in a household wellness package sent to the Whitmore family properties, including the penthouse on the Upper East Side where David and I lived. I had been consuming this compound for 2.5 years, not by choice, not with any knowledge. Because Eleanor Whitmore had decided at some point before my wedding, with cold deliberation, that I would not produce an heir, not because she was opposed to grandchildren, but because an heir would complicate her control of the family's financial structure. A child creates legal claims. A child creates inheritance considerations. A child creates a party whose interests might conflict with Eleanor's, so she had simply eliminated the possibility. Quietly, medically, without my knowledge or consent. I read this finding at 8 o'clock in the morning in the kitchen of my hotel suite. I had been living in a hotel for 3 weeks by this point, having told David I needed space to think, which was true in a way he was not equipped to understand. I read it, and then I set the document down, and then I made another cup of coffee, and then I stood at the window for a long time looking out at the city. There is a kind of anger that is too large for any conventional expression. It does not manifest as yelling or tears or any of the forms that anger is supposed to take. It manifests as a very particular kind of clarity, the sudden, absolute resolution of every uncertainty, every hesitation, every lingering question about whether what you are about to do is proportionate or justified or kind. It was proportionate. It was justified. And kindness, in this context, was not a value I was required to apply. I called Ethan. Add it to the package, I said. Criminal referral, DA's office. I want the toxicological chain of custody documented to a standard that survives any defense challenge. 3 independent analyses. Already scheduled, Ethan said. Because he knew me, and he had been expecting this call. Good, I said. How close are we? 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3. Then we wait 2 weeks, I said. And we make sure every single piece is perfect. We waited. Eleanor chose the venue herself, which I found fitting. Aurelius was the kind of Manhattan restaurant where the private rooms are designed to communicate inevitability. The low lighting, the leather chairs, the staff trained to appear and disappear without disturbing the atmosphere of confidential importance. It was where, I imagined, Eleanor had conducted many such meetings, where she had delivered terms to people who had not yet understood they were being managed. She called me on a Tuesday morning and said, with the brisk warmth of someone who considers the social niceties a professional courtesy, rather than a genuine impulse, that she thought it was time we had a frank conversation about the family's future, and that she had booked a room at Aurelius for Thursday at noon. Of course, I said. I'll be there. I spent the next 48 hours not preparing. I had been preparing for 18 months. There was nothing left to prepare. Instead, I slept well, ate breakfast both mornings, went to the gym, and spent a quiet Wednesday evening reading a novel. My father had recommended to me years ago that I had never gotten around to finishing. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully. Not dramatically, nothing that would read as statement-making to anyone who didn't know what the meeting was. A charcoal suit, excellent fabric, understated cut. The watch my mother had given me when I made partner, which I wore only on occasions that mattered. My hair the way I always wore it back, clean. The kind of style that says, I have more important things to think about than this. I arrived at Aurelius at 12:15. The maitre d' showed me to the private room. I sat down, ordered sparkling water, and checked my phone for the last time before putting it in my bag. Ethan had sent a single message. Everything is ready. Your call. I put the phone away. Eleanor and David arrived at 12:20. I watched them walk across the room toward me. Eleanor first. Impeccable as always. Cream silk. The pearl earrings she wore when she wanted to project old money authority, and David behind her, wearing the expression I had come to think of as his mother's waiting room face. A careful blankness designed to look like neutrality. A face that had learned to hold no position until it was told what position to hold. Sarah, darling, Eleanor said, and kissed me on the cheek, and sat down. The waiter appeared. They ordered. Small talk was made about the restaurant, the weather, a gallery opening that Eleanor had attended. I participated in this small talk the way you participate in the formalities before a very important meeting. Fully present, entirely focused, saying nothing of substance. Then Eleanor folded her hands on the table. What followed was, as I said, 12 minutes of the most elegantly constructed extortion I have ever witnessed. She began with the family narrative, the Whitmore legacy, the responsibilities of wealth, the philosophy of unified family resources that had served the family for generations, She moved through the history of the family investment firm and the role that Consolidated Capital had played in its success. She arrived, finally, at the specific requirements. She needed access to all of my primary bank accounts. She needed the liquidation of certain investment holdings. She specified 3 of them, which told me she had been reviewing my portfolio more carefully than I had officially permitted. She needed a comprehensive power of attorney giving her authority over my financial affairs. And then the threat. Phrased, as everything with Eleanor was phrased, in the register of practical observation rather than coercion. She noted that David had been finding the marriage difficult. She noted that a contentious divorce would be costly and time-consuming and professionally damaging for someone in my position. She noted that these things could be avoided through cooperation. Throughout this, David looked at the breadbasket. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, I allowed a silence of approximately 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough that she couldn't fill it before I spoke. Eleanor, I said, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. You'd like me to surrender control of my financial assets, liquidate specific holdings, and sign a power of attorney. And you're suggesting that if I decline, there will be marital consequences. Eleanor smiled. I'm suggesting that family. I understand what you're suggesting. I turned to David. David, I need you to be present for this, not just physically. For the past 3 years, I have been providing your family with direct and indirect financial support, amounting to approximately $100,000 per month. Your mother's credit accounts, your brother Michael's car payments and credit lines, your father's club memberships and associated costs. Various accounts that I believe you have not looked at carefully enough to understand originated with me. If you choose your mother's position today, I respect that. But I need you to understand that it is a choice with immediate consequences. David opened his mouth. He looked at Eleanor. That look. I had seen that look 500 times. I saw it for the last time now. And it was exactly what I had always known. It was a man checking with his manager before responding. I see, I said. I took out my phone. The application I had designed with Ethan's technical team was open and authenticated. Every account, every card, every transfer preloaded for simultaneous execution. I entered the final authentication code. The confirmation prompt appeared. I pressed it. Effective this moment, I said, setting the phone face down on the tablecloth. All financial support I have been providing to the Whitmore family is terminated. The accounts are closed. The cards are canceled. The standing transfers are stopped. The credit lines are revoked. Eleanor's face did something I had been waiting, with considerable patience, to see it fractured. The impeccable composure 63 years of practiced control cracked, just for a moment, just enough. You have no idea, she said very quietly, what you have just done. On the contrary, I said pleasantly, I have an exceptionally thorough idea of exactly what I have done. I've been building the picture for 18 months. I finished my sparkling water. I left cash for the waiter. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and looked at Eleanor one more time, not with contempt, because contempt is a wasted emotion, but with the clear and complete attention of someone who has finally confirmed every hypothesis she has spent years testing. The next conversations we have, I said, will be through attorneys. And I walked out of Aurelius into the cold March afternoon, and the air was clean and very cold and completely clear. I had not, of course, simply ended the money and waited to see what happened. That would have been emotionally satisfying and strategically incomplete. The financial termination was the first of 14 steps, and the remaining 13, executed with the precision of a sequence designed by 2 people who had spent 18 months thinking about nothing else. I monitored the first 48 hours from my hotel suite with a laptop, a pot of good coffee, and the particular focused calm that I had developed over years of watching complex systems either hold or fail. This was failure, carefully engineered and extensively planned. It was not something I watched with pleasure. Exactly, pleasure was not quite the right word for what I felt during those 2 days. Something more austere. Something that resembled, most closely, the specific satisfaction of a proof that works. Michael Whitmore arrived at the Porsche dealership in Midtown at 3 p.m. on Thursday. I had a contact who worked in financial services for the dealership group, not an operative, simply someone who mentioned to me afterward what had occurred. Michael came in wearing a new sport coat and an expression of settled entitlement. The woman beside him in the specific category of company that exists to be impressed by car purchases. The Porsche 911 was silver. Michael had specified the exact configuration 2 weeks earlier. The first card declined. Michael's response, working through 4 additional cards with increasing urgency, his expression shifting from confused to embarrassed to something closer to panicked. The sales staff managing the situation with the exquisite professional tact of people paid to make difficult moments invisible, while making them feel exactly as visible as they are, was, by all accounts, an experience that would be referenced among certain midtown car sales professionals for some time. He left without the car. He did not leave calmly. Richard Whitmore's moment came the same afternoon at the Haverford Country Club in Connecticut, where he had been a member for 31 years and where his standing, carefully cultivated, deeply valued, was as much a part of his identity as his name. The quarterly membership fee had been processed on an automatic transfer from an account that no longer had funds to transfer. The club's billing office contacted him, very politely, during the Thursday lunch service. He was in the main dining room at the time, with 3 other members he had known for decades. Richard Whitmore was 70 years old and had never, in those 70 years, been publicly embarrassed about money. The experience was new. It was also, based on subsequent reports from mutual social acquaintances, not managed gracefully. Eleanor's situation was more complex and took longer to manifest, because Eleanor's situation was more complex in its origins. The asset freeze order on her private accounts, which our legal team had filed 6 days before the Aurelius lunch, as a precautionary measure enabled by the regulatory complaint. Ethan had worked through the banking system over the course of Thursday and Friday. Eleanor did not discover the full extent of it until Friday morning, when she attempted to access funds she had been counting on. The private lenders who had been patient while the assets existed became, as I had calculated, they would considerably less patient once the assets were unavailable. By Friday evening, Eleanor had received 3 phone calls and 2 in-person visits that I was not present for, but that I have been reliably informed were not conducted in the Register of Polite Inquiry. David called me 11 times between Thursday and Saturday. I did not answer. On Sunday, he sent a text message that read, "Sarah, whatever I have done, please. This isn't about us anymore. People are being hurt. Can we talk?" I read it twice. Then, I set the phone down and went back to the document I was reviewing, a legal filing that would be submitted Monday morning, the next step in the sequence. The people being hurt, I noted to myself, were being hurt by the consequences of choices they had made. That is different from being hurt. I did not respond to David's text. The information about Chentech had to be released carefully, and we had planned the release with the same care we had brought to everything else. It went first to the SEC and the Department of Justice, with the complete evidentiary package, Ethan's full documentation of the shell company structure, the IP acquisition chain, the mechanism of the bankruptcy, the regulatory complaint that had been used as a weapon. It went with a cover letter from our lead attorney that laid out the timeline and the supporting evidence with a clarity that required no interpretation. Then it went to journalists, 3 of them, at 3 different publications, selected after careful review of their track records on financial fraud stories, specifically their accuracy rates, their editorial independence, and their willingness to sit on a story until they had confirmed everything independently, rather than racing to publication on incomplete information. I spoke with each of them once, off the record for the background, on the record for 3 specific facts. I did not perform a motion for them. I gave them the documents and the timeline and let the evidence speak in the register it was most eloquent in. The Chentech story broke on a Monday morning in a 6,000-word investigation. By noon, it was the most read article on the publication's website. By 3 p.m., the Wall Street Journal had confirmed it independently through their own sources and published a shorter follow-up. By the time the markets closed, Richard Whitmore's name was attached to the story in every financial news feed in the country. He had served on 3 charitable boards. He had been a keynote speaker at the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority's annual conference 2 years running. He had a reputation carefully, expensively maintained as a figure of integrity and old-school financial rectitude. That reputation's half-life, once the story broke, was approximately 6 hours. Three of the charitable boards announced reviews of his involvement before the end of the day. Two of his firm's largest clients requested emergency calls. A former colleague who had been featured in a glowing profile with Richard just the previous year quietly deleted his social media post about it. Richard Whitmore had built his social position over 50 years. He had needed Ethan's investigation to unravel it. But once the first thread was pulled, it unraveled very quickly. The criminal referral regarding Eleanor's medical campaign against me went directly to the district attorney's office without any media component. This was deliberate. The toxicology evidence was the most serious element of the entire case, and it deserved to be handled by the appropriate authorities with the gravity and procedural rigor it required, not deployed as a public relations element. Our attorneys submitted the package on a Friday. The DA's office reviewed it over the weekend. On Wednesday of the following week, Eleanor Whitmore was arrested at the Greenwich estate. I watched the coverage on my laptop. The footage was brief. A car in the driveway, figures at the door, Eleanor walking out with her chin, elevated at an angle that I recognized immediately as the Eleanor Whitmore version of composure, under pressure. The presentation maintained even as the structure beneath it collapsed. She had worn a good coat. Of course she had. For a moment, watching that footage, I felt something unexpected, a species of sadness. Not for Eleanor, exactly. For the particular waste of it, 63 years of intelligence and capability and social skill, deployed entirely in service of control and deception and the maintenance of an appearance of wealth that was never real. What Eleanor might have built if she had built honestly, what she had chosen to consume instead. Then I closed the laptop and went to make coffee. David's move came on a Wednesday, while Eleanor was processing her arrest, while Richard was being contacted by the SEC's investigative division, while Michael was discovering that the social world he had navigated effortlessly on the strength of family connections was now navigating away from him with equivalent ease. David called the SEC's whistleblower tip line. He provided, in exchange for a formal cooperation agreement, detailed information about Eleanor's shell company network, the structure, the key participants, the routing of funds. He presented himself as a cooperative witness who had been operating under his mother's authority and had limited awareness of the full extent of the scheme. This was, from a certain angle, a rational calculation. If the structure was coming down regardless, cooperation might offer him a softer landing. He had information that had value. He could trade it. What David had not accounted for was that the information he was offering to trade was information we had already provided. Ethan's submission to the SEC had been submitted weeks earlier and was considerably more comprehensive and better documented than what David was now providing. The SEC investigators noted this. Our attorney, who had been monitoring the investigation, confirmed it within 24 hours. David had nothing to offer. He had only exposed himself in the process of trying to demonstrate his cooperation. He had provided enough detail about his own operational knowledge to establish that his claimed limited awareness was not credible. His employment at the family firm had already been terminated by the firm's remaining partners, who were managing their own exposure. The severance package he had negotiated, which he had apparently been counting on as his financial foundation going forward, was subject to a clawback provision in his employment contract, a provision that our attorneys had identified 18 months earlier and had quietly ensured was preserved and enforceable. The clawback was executed. I am not going to claim that I felt nothing about this. David and I had once in the early months been something real. The warmth I had felt then was real. The loss of it, the slow, accumulating loss of it, spread across 2 years of choices that moved him further and further away was real. Even at the end, even watching the consequences of his choices manifest completely, I felt the weight of the distance between what he had been at the beginning and what he had chosen to become. But feeling weight is not the same as being moved by it. I felt it, and I did not change course. The course was correct. The weight was the cost of the distance, and the distance was his choice, not mine. Legal proceedings have their own timeline, which respects no one's need for resolution. The formal processes took 8 months from the initial filings to the final dispositions, and I will give you the essential outline without the procedural detail, because the procedural detail is significant, only to attorneys and to people who plan to find themselves in similar situations, which I sincerely hope you do not. Richard Whitmore pleaded to charges related to the Chentech Matters securities fraud, tortious interference, and related counts. He received a sentence that included substantial financial penalties, a permanent bar from the investment industry, and a civil settlement with my father's estate, which, as his only surviving heir, I administered that amounted to the full value of the patents plus 15 years of licensing revenue, compounded. It was not the total reversal of 15 years. Nothing could be. My father was still dead. The years he had lived in the shadow of that failure were still spent. The heart attack at 61 was still real. But the money was real too, and it became the financial foundation of something I will tell you about shortly. Eleanor's criminal case was longer and more contested. Her attorneys were good. She had chosen them carefully. Because Eleanor always chose carefully, and they fought the toxicology evidence on every available procedural ground. The chain of custody for every sample. The independence of the 3 toxicological analyses. The connection between the prescription and the household delivery records. Every junction in the evidentiary chain. Every challenge failed. Because we had built the chain to be unchallengeable. Because I had spent 18 months making sure there was nothing in it that could be legitimately disputed. Because Ethan had done this work with the thoroughness it deserved. Eleanor received a sentence that I will not enumerate in detail, not because I am protecting her, but because the specific terms are less important than the outcome. Eleanor Whitmore's financial structure was completely dismantled. The Greenwich estate was sold to satisfy creditors. The private lenders who had filed their own claims once the assets were frozen received partial settlement. Eleanor's social world, which had been her actual source of power, evaporated with a speed that was almost elegant. She maintained her composure through all of it, in public. I do not know what she was in private. I find I do not particularly need to know. David's settlement was civil rather than criminal. The clawback, the civil liability for his knowing participation in certain transactions, and the divorce settlement negotiated through attorneys over 3 months, with precisely the contentious efficiency I had predicted, left him with considerably less than he had begun with. No family fortune to fall back on, and a professional reputation that required significant reconstruction. He was not imprisoned. I had not sought that. I had sought consequences, and consequences were delivered. I changed my name on a Thursday morning, 4 months after the legal proceedings concluded. It is, as I noted earlier, a simple legal process. A filing, some forms, some updated identification. The practical dimensions of it are not dramatic, but the experiential dimensions were significant to me in ways that are difficult to fully articulate to anyone who hasn't spent 3 years being someone they didn't choose to be. Sarah Whitmore had been a name I accepted in good faith, and wore with the particular discomfort of a garment that almost fits close enough to wear, wrong enough to always notice. I had not hated the name. I had not been damaged by it in any direct way. But it was not mine, and I had known, almost from the beginning, that it was not mine. And there is a specific kind of weariness that comes from knowing that something attached to you is not actually yours. I signed the final legal document, and I was Sarah Chen again. I sat in the attorney's conference room for a moment after signing, and I thought about my father, who had given me this name, who had written code before sunrise and talked about his company with tenderness and believed the world would reward honest work, who had been wrong about the world's willingness to reward him, but not wrong about the value of the work itself, whose name I was carrying again. I thought I will make this name mean something, more than he got to make it mean, in addition to what he made it mean. Then I thanked the attorney, put on my coat, and walked out into the afternoon. Ethan and I had been discussing Phoenix Asset Management for almost a year before we officially founded it, in the way that you discuss something you both know is inevitable, but that cannot be formally begun until the other obligations are resolved. The founding came 3 weeks after the name change. We incorporated in New York and Singapore simultaneously because we had already identified clients in both markets. And because we had learned, in the preceding 18 months, the value of operating across multiple jurisdictions. Phoenix specializes in exactly the category of work that the preceding 3 years had made me. The world's leading expert in the gap between financial presentation and financial reality. We work with clients who need someone to tell them what they are actually looking at, not the narrative, not the presentation, not the elegant structure that has been built to make an investment or a partnership or a family financial arrangement look safe and sound. The actual underlying numbers, the actual risk. Our clients are people who have learned, often at significant cost, that appearances and realities diverge more frequently than comfortable assumption allows. They come to us because they need someone who will look at the thing as it actually is. We are very good at this. We are, I believe without false modesty, the best in the specific field we occupy. This is because we have done the most expensive possible version of the relevant training, and because Ethan is the finest forensic financial analyst I have ever worked with, and because I have a particular and hard-won talent for identifying the precise moment when a structure, financial, personal, social, is performing stability rather than embodying it. The James Chen Innovation Foundation launched 6 months after Phoenix. It is funded by the civil settlement from Richard Whitmore's estate, which had a certain poetic justice that I did not plan but do not pretend not to appreciate. The foundation supports early-stage software entrepreneurs specifically, first-generation founders, people building from nothing with intelligence and determination, and without the inherited safety nets that make early-stage risk tolerable. It provides not just capital but legal support, specifically the kind of legal infrastructure that my father never had access to, the kind that would have protected Chen Tech from the campaign that destroyed it. My father built things in the belief that good work is its own protection. He was wrong about that. The foundation is, in part, my argument with his naivety, not because his belief was wrong in any moral sense, but because the world is not organized around moral correctness, and the people who build honestly deserve the same legal armor as the people who do not. We have funded 11 companies in the first year. 4 of them are already generating revenue. 1 of them is going to be extraordinary. My father would have liked them all. He would have asked about the code architecture and made technical suggestions that would have been both completely accurate and slightly outdated, because he was always 6 months behind on the latest frameworks, and he would have laughed at himself about it. I miss him. I will always miss him. The foundation does not replace what was taken from him. Nothing does. But it means his name is attached to something that helps the people he would have wanted to help, which is the best I can do from here. I want to address something directly, because I have thought about it carefully and I believe it deserves care. People tell this story as a revenge story. I understand why. The structure supports it, the wronged party, the patient accumulation of evidence, the devastating final strike, the satisfying collapse of the people who caused the harm. It is a clean narrative. It resolves completely. It offers the reader the pleasure of a justice that, in reality, arrives rarely and in much messier form. But I have to be honest with you, because I promised myself honesty, and because I think the revenge framing actually obscures what the story is really about. I was not motivated by revenge. I was motivated by accuracy. There is a difference, and it matters. Revenge is emotional. It is organized around the satisfaction of the injured party, around the desire to see suffering inflicted on the people who caused suffering. It is about the feeling of the outcome. Accuracy is different. It is organized around correspondence between what happened and what is recorded, between what was done and what its consequences are. It is about the truth of the outcome. I wanted the truth on the record. I wanted Richard Whitmore's destruction of my father's company to exist, officially, as a fact, not as my father's private and unverifiable experience of failure, but as a documented, prosecuted, adjudicated fact. I wanted Eleanor's medical campaign against me to be named for what it was and treated accordingly. I wanted the gap between the Whitmore family's presentation and their reality to be visible to everyone who had been deceived by the presentation. These things happened not because I engineered a revenge, but because I documented a truth. The consequences were proportionate to the facts. That is not revenge. That is what consequences look like when the facts are actually allowed to operate. I am not telling you there was no satisfaction in it. I am telling you that satisfaction was not the goal, and that confusing the two matters if you are trying to understand what actually happened and why. I also want to tell you about the cost, because stories about vindication tend to present the victorious party as having traveled through difficulty and emerged intact. And I think that framing is dishonest in a way that does a disservice to anyone who has been through something similar. I emerged changed, not intact. There is a difference. The 2.5 years of the fertility compound, the full medical picture of what that means for me, for any future pregnancy, for what I might or might not be able to have, is not a question that has been fully answered. I am working with medical specialists. I am being patient with uncertainty in the way that I am constitutionally not well suited for. The answer will come when it comes, and I am managing that wait as best I can. The grief for what my marriage was supposed to be for the version of David Whitmore, who existed in the first 6 months, before I understood the full architecture of what I was living inside. That grief is real and it is ongoing. I do not think it ever fully resolves. I think it becomes part of the texture of a person's interior life, present, integrated, no longer acute but never entirely absent either. I have made my peace with carrying it. The grief for my father, renewed and deepened by the discovery of what was done to him, is the hardest thing I carry. I had mourned him as a man who had suffered a natural misfortune, the random cruelty of a market that did not reward his work. Learning that the cruelty was not random, that it was chosen and deliberate and executed by someone who would later sit at my dinner table and call me my dear, that changed the shape of the grief. It is heavier now, more specific, more angry, though the anger has nowhere left to go, because the person who deserves it has already faced the consequences. And anger delivered to a consequence is just noise. I grieve him differently now, more honestly perhaps, with a clearer understanding of what was taken from him and from me. That is not better exactly, but it is true. I deleted the data. When all legal proceedings were concluded and all filing requirements satisfied, when every piece of evidence had served its evidentiary purpose, and no further legal use remained, I deleted the 18 months of documentation, the encrypted files, the audio recordings, the financial analyses, the toxicology reports. Everything that had not been submitted to a regulatory body or court was gone. Ethan argued against it. He wanted me to archive it. Insurance, he said. You never know what comes back. I know, I said. I know exactly what's coming back. Nothing. It's over. You can't be certain of that. No, I agreed. I can be certain enough. I deleted it because I had made myself a promise. The promise was this work, the documentation, the investigation, the building of the case was work done in service of a specific purpose. When the purpose was complete, the work was complete. It was not going to become my permanent condition. It was not going to be the thing I maintained indefinitely. The archive I kept as proof that the injustice had been real. The record I carried as identity. I knew what I had been through. The people who needed to know it officially now knew it officially. The rest, the private record of 3 years of harm I was choosing not to carry. This is, I think, the most misunderstood part of the story. People hear she deleted the evidence and they hear weakness or forgiveness or some kind of resolution that implies the harm was not that serious. It was not any of those things. It was a decision about what I was going to build my future on. I was not going to build it on a museum of what had been done to me. I deleted the files. I watched the progress bar on the secure deletion application run to completion. And then I closed the laptop and made dinner, and watched something completely unserious on television and went to sleep at a reasonable hour. It was the best sleep I had had in 3 years.